Okay, in this video, I wanted to walk you through a few last minute points as you go into submitting the document, the research document. The first would be to just go back in again and click the signature work info link in the dashboard, and then pull up the document that says research document specifics and open that up. And when you do, you'll see that it looks like this. Just a quick walkthrough of every last minute piece of information here. The first is that the total number of words of this final signature work should be 1,250 to 1,500 words. You want to be in that ballpark. I will allow you up to 500 more words. So you can go as high as 2,000. And that would include all words between and including the first word of the introduction and the final word of the conclusion. You wouldn't want to go above that though. And you certainly would not want to go below 1,250 words for that range, okay? So 1,250 to 1,500 is preferred. You can go up to 2,000. Do not go above 2,000. Do not go below 1,250. Everything I say in point 2 pretty much matches the points that we went over this week about structure. Your thesis statement should be the final sentence of the introduction. In it should be embedded the 3 areas of discussion, and each area should be represented by a word or a phrase. And that word or a phrase in the sequence of how they appear in that sentence, the thesis statement, should anticipate the structure or forecast the structure of the body paragraphs. You know, the first item should reflect the first section of body paragraphs. The second item should reflect the second section of body paragraphs. And of course, the third item should reflect the third section of body paragraphs. The example from post 16 today is important for that very reason, about voluntary physician-assisted suicide. As worded at the top, that would be an example of an adequately worded thesis that contains 3 areas of discussion embedded within it. And the point of filling out this chart, as you've been asked to do between now and Sunday, is to get a handle on how you plan, at least at this stage, to spread out your source material, your 4 sources across those 3 sections. So that's important. And really the point of, knowing your 3 areas of discussion before getting a perfectly worded thesis statement, that's also important, because you can go back and smooth things out and arrive at a perfectly worded thesis statement, or a decently worded one, after you produce the body paragraphs in the middle of the paper. I mean, you really want to know those 3 areas before anything else, and then write freely within those 3 areas, spread them out, develop clear identifiable body paragraphs and create strong linkages between one section to the next. And that each body paragraph would be about 8 to 10 sentences, or 8 to 10 lines, whichever comes first. The main ideas sentence of each body paragraph should both identify a topic and say something about a topic. And here's another hint that I think is extremely important. When you quote strategically, when you insert your 4 sources throughout these 3 sections of body paragraphs, the best place to quote would be in the middle of the body paragraphs themselves, not the beginnings or the end. Ideally, you want to have the main idea sentence begin with your own words, your own thoughts, your own ideas, and end those body paragraphs, again, with your own words, your own thoughts, and your own ideas. So I think that also covers point 3, but what I can say further would be, I would want to see a bare minimum of style of quotations. So what I mean by that is, I want at least 1 and no more than 2 block quotations. So a quick reminder of how block quotations work just in terms of having a visual, I am in the Purdue Owl website, right? And let me just do a share screen to make sure that you're seeing what I'm seeing. The point of long quotations is that they have to be more than 4 lines of prose. And verse is poetry. I don't think any of you would be quoting poetry. But when you are quoting more than 4 lines of prose, like as you see in this example, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 total lines of prose. You begin with your own words in a conventional format. And then 1 tab space from a flush left margin would be where you, like around here, where you would begin a typical body paragraph. But you want to do 2 tab spaces from a flush left margin, which would move us here. And then all of the text is blocked. It's blocked, as you see in the far left, or from the far left margin, 2 tab spaces over. All of these words are from Bronte 78. Bronte 78. And the thing to remember about block quotations, they're blocked off like this. You lead into them with your own words. Usually a colon would be a good approach, a colon to announce the quoted content. But also worth noting is that there are no quotation marks around the borrowed text. The only time you would include quotation marks here would be if the original source had quotation marks around any of the words within the excerpt that you're quoting. Then you would have double quotation marks around those words here, which lets me know that it's not you who's quoting them, that they appeared originally quoted in the original source. The other thing worth pointing out is that punctuation here goes before the parenthetical reference. So usually you've been taught that when you have quotation marks, you close the quotation, you then have the parenthetical reference, and then you have the punctuation. But here, because no quotation marks would be used, you would have the then punctuation preceding the parenthetical reference. So this would be an instance of how to use a block quotation. Now, note how they begin the paragraph with the student's own words. You have the quoted content. I would advise you as a best practice not to use or not to end body paragraphs with block quotations. Give me a word, or a line or two with your own words as a sentence that would both close out the paragraph, but also interpret the quotation that was just provided. And I think that's a good strategy to use when creating block quotations this way. Okay, so I want 1 to 2 of those at least throughout the paper. Now, if you use more, so be it, but you're going to probably find a piece of text, from any one of your 4 sources where you feel like you can't trim it meaningfully, like you have to say the whole thing. So that could be an instance where a block quotation would be warranted. And note, by the way, that I use block and long interchangeably. To me, it's a distinction without a difference. I'm also requiring 2 to 4 direct quotations. Now, direct quotations, nothing new. The whole point about quotations is that you mix your words with the source's words. And I'm doing another share screen here just to make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. You mix your words, according to some, Dreams Express, with the source's words. Profound aspects of personality, though others disagree. So we begin with the student's words, we move into the quoted content, and then we move out back to the student's words. The thing to remember is that all quotation marks would enclose the borrowed words from the source. That's important. And that you would have the parenthetical reference with the author's last name and page number directly after the closed quotation mark. And you would do that, or you would include the author's name for instances where the name does not appear in the sentence. So we don't have folks here because the student decided to use a more general description as to where this sentiment is coming from. So folks 185 would identify the source in the parenthetical itself, and they conveniently did it here instead of here because you'll note that there are no quotation marks here. So if the student had quotation marks around profound aspects of personality and then didn't have the parenthetical, but then put in their own words, though others disagree, and then put folks after disagree, that would give the impression that folks said, though others disagree. But what we find out here is that we can't say conclusively that folks is making this point, though others disagree. And that's important. You're being as accurate as possible. Same thing here, according to the folks study, dreams may express, excuse me, profound aspects of personality. Again, you're enclosing the words from the actual source, enclosed in quotation marks, 184. And the question that the student is phrasing in this third example is based on a premise of folks' point. So either of these approaches would be acceptable. Also worth noting, in the shell, do not be a stranger to the incorporating sources item that is in one of the stacked items in the signature work info page. We have gone over that earlier in the semester, and I'll definitely remind you to take a look at it. I'll spare you going through it, in full today, but that is another worthwhile thing to consider. Now, looking back at research document specifics, indirect quotations is a little bit different, and we had spoken about this already, but just to remind you, if you go into MLA resources in our shell, and I'm just going to do a share screen to make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, and in MLA resources, you scroll down and you click this link to the book that we looked at today. Now, for in-text citations, you're only focusing on numbers 1 through 17. In-text documentation is when you use the parenthetical references to cite your research in the body of your paper itself, not on the works cited page, which you were looking at about post 16. But focus on number 15 here. Source quoted in another source. That refers us to page 9. So a little trick here, Control F, source quoted, and it jumps me right there. Source quoted in another source. When you are quoting text that you found quoted in another source, use the abbreviation of QTD, quoted in the parenthetical reference. So in this example, Tanner on page 7 is quoting what Bronte wrote to Lewis. Now, these are Bronte's words. Why do you like Miss Austen so very much? I'm puzzled on that point. QTD and Tanner 7. So if your article author or authors quote someone else, and you want to quote that someone else, this would be how you do it, the QTD function. All right, so that's definitely important. Now, in this minimum expectation of 2 to 4, direct and or indirect quotations, that's what I mean. You would have borrowed words enclosed in quotation marks, but you would identify either the primary or the indirect source in the parenthetical reference. So one more aspect would be 1 to 3 instances of paraphrase info. Now, we had looked at this again earlier in the semester, but I'll revisit it with you. If you go into signature work info, and then you scroll down to Purdue Owl paraphrase. The thing to remember about paraphrasing is that it operates on this idea of common knowledge. You have to be putting a point from any of your sources in your own words. And that would mean, technically, that you do not have to include or enclose quotation marks around those borrowed words. But you would have to use the common knowledge test. So at that point, even though it's in your own words, but it would not, in your opinion, be considered common knowledge, you would still need to create a parenthetical reference after it. So for example, in this original passage, all of these words right here were what was produced in the original author. So that is, a point in and of itself, and they actually use the works cited passage after it. This is an example of how a student took this excerpt, put it in their own words, but determined that the point that Lester was making here was not considered common knowledge. So therefore, the student really couldn't present this as their own idea. It was Lester's, even though it was in the student's own wording. So you still, even though you don't have quotation marks around specific words, you would still be required to put a parenthetical reference there. And again, note, since Lester doesn't appear in the sentence, we would include Lester here, no comma, between the author's last name and the page numbers, but we would use a conventional paraphrase citation like that. Now, paraphrases are closer in length to the original passage because it takes the student a little bit longer. A summary is slightly different because with summary, you are not trying to hit all of the subpoints that might be included in an original passage, but instead describe things generally. The best way I can describe it would be when you are true to the spirit of the idea in a paraphrase, but you are speaking about an idea in a summary. So that's a little bit different. The student here is making a broad statement or judgment about the bare bones of the entire excerpt, whereas here, the student is trying to restate the point or the idea directly behind that excerpt instead of speaking about the idea. So it's a slight distinction. Summaries tend to be fewer words than the passages that they're summarizing. Paraphrasing is closer in length to the original because you're trying to include more, even though it's in your own words. So that's a distinction that is certainly worth emphasizing. The 6 steps I think are key. Jot down a few words below your paraphrase to remind you later how you envision this material. At the top of the note card, write a key word or phrase to indicate the subject of your paraphrase. Check your rendition with the original to make sure that your version accurately expresses all the essential information in new form. I think 4 is probably the most important point because you're conveying all of the essential information in this sense of the original form, but in a summary, you're kind of collapsing all of that together and being a little bit more general with it. So that's why there tends to be fewer words in summaries than paraphrasing. Now, the note card method, your mileage may vary. I find it to be effective, but people can vary their approaches. I think the biggest ticket items to remember about paraphrase, similar in length to the original content that you are paraphrasing. No quotation marks. And it has to be something that you think is not considered common knowledge. So the author is still the proprietor of that idea. Summary, which I don't require you to do for this paper anyway, but just for your general knowledge, tends to be fewer words, significantly fewer words than a paraphrase, smaller than the original content, and is more of a rhetorical license on the part of the student because they get to speak to the bare bones minimum most important point of the content instead of trying to recapture all of the components of the original excerpt. So you want to do a standard minimum of paraphrase alongside all of these other obligations. 1 to 3 is my number, 1 to 3 minimum for the whole paper, not just for each section, for the whole papers, right? So 1 to 2 block quotations total for the whole paper, 2 to 4 direct and or indirect quotations, and 1 to 3 paraphrase citations. Again, all for the whole paper, all for those 9 to 15 body paragraphs. You can go above that, but this represents the bare minimum metrics. And another thing to remember would be, ultimately, this paper, 3 parts you, 1 part research. That's another way of saying 75% of the 1,250 to 2,000 total words should be your own, right? So the remaining 25% of your total word count would be the quoted content or the paraphrased content, however you want to perceive of it. And again, remember that you want to include a works cited page after this, right? So if you go back into, you're in the signature work info link on the dashboard, works cited page, we looked at this in class today. This is an example of one properly done to scale, where you identify all of your 4 sources in alphabetical order by the first letter of the entry. So you could go through all of the steps that we did in class today to put those together. So these are essential bits of information here. The only other thing I'm going to say is when it comes time to complete the actual work, I couldn't link it here. I couldn't link the portal to submit the assignment here. But if you go into week 13 in the schedule, you'll see where it says submit signature work here. You would click the black linked text. You can identify the rubric, see the rubric. Just want to make sure that we're doing a quick share screen, that you are seeing everything that I'm seeing. Okay, you share. Okay, you are good. So you can see the rubric straight up, and you would be able to hopefully point out it's virtually the same rubric that was used for the signature work reflections. The only difference is that the point values are a little bit different. It's twice the value now of the 15-point rubric that was used for the signature work reflections, each of the 3 reflections. This one's now going to be 30 points, but it's the same categories. It's the same descriptor text, and the point values have shifted to reflect the increased point total. So really, when you submit it, you would click either this button, Write Submission, and then copy and paste your text within, or you would click Browse Local Files, and you would attach your saved document, knowing full well that you can write it as a Google Doc and convert it to Microsoft Word and then attach it that way. You want also to be sure to agree to the terms that would let your document be viewed alongside the global reference database. And then you can add any optional comments to me that you need to address. And then you would click Submit in the lower right corner. And that would submit the document. Now, there's nothing preventing you from both copying and pasting in the text space, but also attaching the file. You could do both. Or you could just do one or the other. I would suggest, of course, obviously, not writing directly in here, write elsewhere, copy and paste it, because we don't want the system to freeze. So you would do this by, again, Tuesday, December 1, 2020, by before 11:59 p.m. Okay? And only do it when you have read and agreed with this content. It is an informal obligation that basically reflects, your submission of this reflects your compliance with numbers 1 through 7. Read them carefully. Read them carefully and read them on your own and ask for any interpretation, or email me with questions or concerns or anything just to verify that you were on point with these 7 clauses, because your submission of the document would indicate compliance with these 7 points. And that's extremely important. And then when it's submitted, you will have successfully completed the document. So I wanted to touch base on these remaining points, which I thought were helpful, useful. Email me if you have any questions. And remember that the college is not operational on Tuesday of next week, meaning that I will hold office hours on Monday. I will definitely hold office hours on Monday. So email me or check in the office hours if you need to stop by and talk anything out, or if you're comfortable proceeding, this now gives you a game plan.